Chapter 37. Early on the third day of what was beginning to feel like a doomed quest to nowhere, Croc and I blundered into a large school locker room with a slick, mildew-covered floor, filled with rows of lockers and wooden benches that had probably endured more horrors than I could ever even begin to imagine. Just thinking of all the wrinkly nutsacks those benches had witnessed firsthand gave me full-body chills. The gentle pitter-patter of water hitting the floor came from unseen showers off in the distance, and a carpet of misty steam crawled through the room, fogging the communal mirrors hanging above the sinks. Coming from up ahead were voices. Croc and I ducked behind a set of lockers, concealing ourselves from view. Loitering in a large open space between the lockers and the sinks was a ring of delvers, all encircling another delver, who stood in the center with an enormous nail-studded baseball bat drawn, raised, and ready to fucking rumble. The bat-wielding delver in question was female, maybe 5 foot even with a slight figure, and she couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds soaking wet. She was also a furry. Not a Central like Jacob, or some other half-human, half-animal transmog. She was a legit, honest-to-God, furry. Fuck. My life. Delver number 03A-04, B00IJMHAXQ, human, archetypal. Level 19. She wore a skin-tight pink bodysuit with a patch of white fur running down the chest. Cartoonish oversized white paws covered her hands, and she had on a pair of matching furry white boots that went up past her calves. A set of floppy pink bunny ears trailed down her back, completing the look. Thank the good Lord above she wasn't wearing one of those weird full-head furry masks, but I wasn't sure if that made the situation better or worse. Interestingly, she had an eclectic assortment of additional armor strapped on over the bodysuit itself. A single spiked pauldron jutted up from her right shoulder, kept in place with a leather chest harness. A silver vambrace adorned one forearm. She had a ringmail skirt wrapped tight around her hips, hanging down to mid-thigh. A leather belt held an oversized meat cleaver that looked like it had been forged in the foulest pits of Isengard. She looked young, late 20s or early 30s, with pale skin and short blonde hair that looked like it had been styled with the meat cleaver at her hip. Just tells us where he is, Temperance, one of the other delvers was saying. The speaker towered over the furry and had shoulders that belonged on an NFL linebacker, with a gut to match. His skin was rough, almost pebbly, and it looked like he'd just waltzed off the set of a $1 discount version of Mad Max Fury Road. He wore tattered camo pants and hockey pads studded with razor blades. The guy had a bright pink mohawk, styled into pronounced Liberty spikes, and was covered in a legion of colorful tattoos. Except for his forearms. Each forearm, from elbow to fingertips, was completely devoid of skin. Just gristly red meat and strikingly white lengths of tendon. There were 5 members of the gang. Each was dressed in a similar fashion, and all were missing patches of skin below the elbow or around the hands. But no one had as much skin missing as Mohawk. As I examined the leader a little more closely, a tag briefly flickered above his head. Delver number 03V-05, B00IJMHAXQ, human, variant. Level 20. I could have used the researcher's codex to glean a little more information about the man, but I remembered Jacob's warning. This douche was higher level than me, so there was an even money chance that examining him wouldn't work anyway. Plus, Dalkanazzle and his buddies hadn't seen me yet and I didn't want to risk tipping them off beforehand. Instead, I activated Mall Ninja's strike, burning 20 mana as a pocket of deep shadow reached out and engulfed me. The rest of Mohawk's posse ranged in level between 14 and 17, but there were a lot more of them than there were of us. Where who is? The furry said in a clipped accent that sounded vaguely foreign. British maybe. Or possibly Eastern European? Hard to say. A girl wearing a leather jacket decked out in silver studs raised a piece of paper with the image of a man scrawled across the front. It was a caricature drawing, the kind of thing street performers did on the Oceanside Pier, but even though the features were comically over-exaggerated, there was no mistaking who they were looking for. Especially since the name Discount Dan was written in bold, blocky letters directly beneath the image. "Hey, that looks like you, Dan," Croc whispered from behind me. They got the bathrobe and everything, the mimic added. Yeah, no shit, I muttered, gaze still fixed firmly on the scene playing out ahead. Looked like all of my poor life choices were finally coming home to roost. It didn't take a genius to figure out that these were aspirants of the skillless court, and they were on the hunt for little ol' me. We know he's on this level somewhere, Mohawk said. Just tell us where he's and maybe we'll let you go without giving a tribute to the monarch. As Mohawk spoke, another one of his goons, a balding guy with tattoos crawling up the sides of his head and over his face, removed a thin, curved fillet knife. The blade glittered darkly in the buzzing, overhead lights of the locker room. I still don't know what you were talking about, Braxton, the furry replied stiffly, then gave a dismissive sniff. Braxton. Of course Mohawk's name was Braxton. This picture of yours means nothing to me, she said, and I've never met this discount Dan before. Now if you're done interrogating me, I'm on howler business. Mohawk, aka Braxton, chortled and rolled his eyes. I still don't understand what you see in those losers, Temp. They're weak. Soft. They have their dumb fucking rules and play pretend that we can be civilized. But this isn't civilization. This is the fucking wilderness. It's survival of the fittest, and you know that better than anyone. A crooked grin stretched across his face. You're broken, like us. You know that, don't you? I know that if you try and lay a single hand on me, I'm going to cut your dick off, she said, sounding as saccharine sweet as a Disney princess. She even batted her long eyelashes at him and gave him a disarming smile that looked positively feral. Mohawk chuckled. That attitude right there could take you far in the red hands, Temp. You know I like 'em feisty. Just tell us what you know about Discount Dan here, he thumped the paper, and I'll put in a good word for you with Hudson. He and I are like this. He raised a hand and crossed his fingers. One word from me, and you'll be a lieutenant and not some little bitch running errands for those fur-faced fucks in the hold. Her hand tightened around the handle of the baseball bat. I already told you, she said, still smiling, I don't know what you were talking about. But like I said earlier, if you want to get feisty, I'd be more than happy to cut your knob off so you can go fuck yourself with it. There were coarse laughs from the other Delvers present, but Mohawk wasn't laughing. The smile slipped away, and anger rippled beneath the surface of his face. There's a difference between feisty and disrespectful, Mohawk growled, his brow furrowing in displeasure. And maybe you haven't seen Discount Dan, but a little birdie tells me you know more than you're letting on. How many times did your mother drop you on the head? Because for the last time, I don't know. Mohawk's hand lashed out like a striking cobra and snagged a tiny bit of red yarn from her finger. I hadn't even noticed it was there. A twinning ring. One of mine. Cut the bullshit, Temp. How's about you start telling us the truth before Jordan, he hooked a thumb toward face tattoos, has to start carving, eh? Face tattoos offered a malicious grin filled with yellowed and rotting teeth, then advanced a step with the fillet knife outstretched. God damn it, Braxton, I don't know him, she spat. I saw one of his warnings, just the same as you and anyone else with a pair of functional eyes. If you want the ring, you can take it. Go deal with him yourself. That might be the first honest thing you've said today, Mohawk replied, nodding. Unfortunately, we already tried to pay him a visit. The door won't work for us. Not for any aspirant. But you're not one of us. Maybe if you were to go and take care of the problem for us. He trailed off. She pouted. Oh, does poor little baby need someone to kill the big bad man for you? She needled. Well, tough luck because I don't take requests. I only kill the people I want to kill. Like you, if you don't leave me alone. I have no doubt you'd got me if you could, Mohawk sneered, but we both know you can't. And for someone who doesn't take requests, you seem more than happy to do bitch work for the howlers. That's because they don't make me want to vomit in my mouth when I look at them. He backhanded her across the face with casual cruelty, splitting her bottom lip wide open. She staggered a few steps from the blow but didn't seem cowed in the least. Instead, there was a dangerous, deadly fire burning in her eyes. I'm done with your bullshit, Temp. You don't want to play nice? He shrugged. That's fine. But then neither will we. If you aren't gonna help us out, then I'm afraid we'll have to take an offering of flesh, Bunny Rabbit. She tensed, and I couldn't tell if she was going to turn tail and run or try to beat the shit out of the guy with her baseball bat. It seemed like she could go either way. I'll let you pick, Mohawk said, clearly not worried about whatever threat she might pose. Left ear, or right? Which'll it be? For what? She snarled. For picking up this stupid ring. You're going to take one of my ears for that. Mohawk nodded in agreement. Yep, he confirmed. Since we can't get to the man himself, we've been given orders to go after his customers. Try to firmly dissuade anyone from using his services. Looks like that includes you. The nasty sneer tugged at the corners of his lips. Now, which'll it be, temp? Left? A long pause. Or right? There was a manic, almost hungry glint in his eyes, but it couldn't match the sheer batshit crazy intensity in her gaze. I could tell the pink-suited, baseball bat-wielding furry wasn't gonna go down easy. She was gonna fight these fuckers to the end, win, lose, or draw. Even if they killed her for it. In that moment, I knew I was going to do something stupid. Just like I'd known I was going to do something stupid back in the lobby when I'd helped the gunslinger against a demon that could kill me with a look. Much as I wanted to make a smart choice, I couldn't turn my back on this lady, even if she was a furry, and even if Croc and I were outnumbered and outclassed on pretty much every level. This lady was elbow deep in shit sandwich, and it was partially my fault. If I walked away, I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror without seeing her stupid, bunny-eared face. And even if I ran now, this wouldn't end here. These post-apocalyptic doucho waffles were going to target my customers. If I wanted to stay in business, I needed to send a message. A strong one. Plus, helping her was the right thing to do. Even if it was also the stupid thing to do. Get ready, Croc, I whispered just loud enough for the mimic's ears. It's time to kill some motherfuckers. But don't worry, they're the bad ones. Chapter 38 Croc and I needed a game plan before barreling in there like reckless morons. I mean, we were morons for not just running away, but we could try to avoid being reckless. As my dad always used to tell me growing up, if you're going to do something stupid, try to be smart about it. I did a cursory scan of each of the 5 members and got a baseline level for each of them. 4 of the 5 were archetypal human, while their boss was a human variant. Starting with the lowest level member of the group, I metaphorically rolled the dice and used the codex to pull up a rudimentary bio-report on his spatial core. Richard Johnson. Specimen biotag ID number 038-01-B00R7T569C. Variant assimilation level, 14. Race, human, archetypal. ___________. Health, 114. Stamina reserve, 70. Mana pool, 24. _____________. Spatial core, active. C. Thick skin, level 8. C. Pocket sand, level 1. C. Curb stomp, level 3. C. Bare knuckle brawler, level 5. C. Escalation of force, level 3. C. Shoulder check, level 4. U. Dumpster dive, level 5. U. Razor wire fisticuffs, level 6. U. Double bounce, level 5. R. Affiliations of record. Hudson's Red Hands, Pledge. Skinless Court, Neophyte Aspirant. Although the codex didn't allow me to see anything else, based on his stats and the names of the individual relics, it wasn't hard to guess that this guy was a brawler of one variety or another. The scuffed brass knuckles hugging his fists confirmed my suspicions. The guy didn't seem to notice that I'd scanned him at all, which meant he likely had a shitty perception score, so I moved on to the next lowest-ranking member of the party and progressively worked my way up from there. They had another shitkicker type at level 16, while the guy with the fillet knife was a level 17 who seemed to specialize in torture. He had relics with names like Thumbscrew Grip, Sadistic Glee, Embomber's Anesthesia, Tripwire, and Crude Stitch, though he had a fair number of healing relics as well. When I scanned the fourth member of the group, though, things went sideways. Natasha Anno was level 18, and unlike the rest of her pals, her mana pool was through the roof and her relics clearly leaned toward the arcane. She had a few support buffs, but most of her spells were ranged damage dealers. Her back stiffened as I scanned her, and her head snapped up, eyes flaring wide. "Well, shit. We've got company," she growled softly, gaze darting around the room. "Who've you got with you, Temperance?" Mohawk asked, suddenly looking nervous. "One of the enforcers from the Howlers maybe?" He paused, a sneer curling his lips. "Or maybe some other little bitch boy, looking to curry favor with the rest of the Furberts." He wheeled around without waiting for her to reply, scanning the darkened corners of the locker room. I instinctively scooted further back into the shadows. "Come on out, little bitch boy, we were just playing," he called, voice echoing off the tiled floors. "We weren't really gonna hurt her. Just planning to put a little fear into her heart." He was looking the wrong way, toward the showers, which were still jettisoning thick curls of steam, but he'd turned my way before too long. I pitched my voice low. "We need to move fast, Croc. Hit him while we still have the element of surprise." "Are you sure, Dan?" Croc whispered back. "Because this seems like a very bad idea." "It is a bad idea," I agreed, "but that weirdo in the bunny suit needs our help. And sometimes doing the right thing is a bad idea, but you gotta do it anyway." "Are we gonna die, Dan?" Croc asked, though he sounded more determined than scared. "Not if we are smart," I lied, feeling a small jab of guilt. Friends weren't supposed to lie to each other, but telling him the truth wouldn't help anything. In a firefight, your troops needed to see confidence, not uncertainty. "But we'll need to be decisive. That lady," I jabbed a finger at the spellcaster, "Natasha, is bad news, so I'm gonna kill her before she can do any real damage. I'm going to make a big distraction, then we're gonna do Croc-a-pult. I want you to aim for the spell slinger, understand?" "Oh, fiddlesticks," Croc murmured. "We haven't tested Croc-a-pult yet." "No time like the present," I replied. "While I'm dealing with the spellcaster, you're going to have to handle Mohawk and his knuckle-dragging buddies for a little while. Make sure they don't surround you. Hopefully Rabbit Ears over there will be able to help us out. If things get too bad, I want you to run. I'll be able to find you after the dust settles." "I don't see any dust, Dan," Croc replied, sounding worried. "Just a figure of speech," I said. "Now get your game face on." Croc manifested a pair of dark eyebrows, which slanted sharply downward across the top of its googly eyes, making the dog look like an angry anime character. It was more hilarious than intimidating, but I didn't tell the dog that. Croc was trying its best. "I'm ready, Dan. Let's kick some bad guy butt in the name of justice and Froyo." "For Froyo," I agreed solemnly. The dog's form shivered, morphing into what could only be called a half-sized replica of a medieval catapult. One with a crooked mouth, googly eyes, and angry black eyebrows, of course. Still cloaked in shadow, I slipped into the bucket, said a small prayer to sweet baby Jesus above, then targeted Mohawk and unleashed a full-strength Drano bolt while his back was still partially turned toward me. "We've got incoming!" Someone screamed, but it was too late. The blue ball of corrosive magic roared into Mohawk with a wet slap and the sizzle of flesh as the spell immediately went to work. And because I'd cast while shrouded in the Mall Ninja's veil, the attack hit for 3 times its normal damage, dealing a total of 75 points of corrosive burst damage on impact, knocking the ugly son of a bitch's health down by nearly half. And the additional DPS damage immediately began shredding his health, mana, and stamina bars. "Hey, Dick Noodles," I proclaimed as the aspirants of the court turned toward me in evident shock, "I'm Discount Dan, and you'd better keep my name out of those cock-holsters you call mouths." They all stared at me in complete and utter disbelief. Then an enraged war cry went up and the 2 brawlers and Mohawk all rushed toward us with squeals of inarticulate fury. I fired off a second round of Drano Bolt, burning through another 15 mana, then activated Split Cast, peeling the single spell into two smaller blobs of corrosive death. The first hit Mohawk dead in the face, splattering across his eyes, while the second caught the bare-knuckle brawler across the lower jaw and chest. Unfortunately, the guy was wearing black football pads, covered in graffiti and metal rivets, so the blast only did a few points of damage. I wanted to kick myself for not using pressure washer instead, but it was too late now. I had 54 mana left and I would need almost all of that for my plan to work. "Come get some, shitheads," I growled, making a "come at me bro" gesture, baiting them onward as I drew my hammer from its loop with my other hand. At the same time, I cast a glance behind the ranks of charging shit-kickers and saw that Bunny Ears was now going toe-to-toe with the Hellraiser wannabe with the fillet knife. A furious green halo had erupted around her, and the baseball bat was a whirlwind in her hands. She effortlessly slapped aside a knife thrust with the bat, then pointed it at face tattoos and unleashed a ball of writhing black shadow. When the inky ball hit her assailant, it exploded into 1,000 smaller shadows. They scuttled across the man's face, wriggled into his ears and nose, slid down his neck, then disappeared beneath his armor. Face Tattoos shrieked bloody murder, dropped his knife, and frantically scratched at his eyes. "Spiders! You shot me in the face with a ball of spiders, you stupid bitch. If you think the face is bad, just wait until they get to your asshole," she cackled, before swinging her bat in a vicious arc, burying the nail-studded head into his thigh. He squealed like a pig and dropped to the ground, bat still lodged firmly in his leg. Temperance watched on in glee as he flailed and rolled, slapping frantically at the legion of scurrying spiders that were swarming his body. I was as horrified as I was impressed. Meanwhile, the spell slinger, Natasha, was in the middle of an incantation, a ball of seething red light coalescing between her palms. "I don't think so," Temperance the bunny said. She thrust one hand out, her palm flat, and shouted, "Talk to the hand." Her voice crashed into the enemy spellcaster like a physical blow. The red ball abruptly blinked off as a thick shroud of silence enveloped her completely. Some sort of mute spell, I was guessing. There was never going to be a better time than now. The three brawlers were almost on top of us, Old Face Tattoos was slowly getting back to his feet, and the spellcaster was momentarily stunned into silence. "Now!" I thundered at Croc. There was a sharp twang and I felt the ground jerk beneath me, propelling me upward and forward all at once. I triggered moving walkway a heartbeat before my feet disconnected from the faux wooden platform and the spell propelled me through the air and toward the spell slinger like a human missile. The attack had worked so well against Harold the Terror Clown that Croc and I had been experimenting with ways to make the technique more effective. Having the mimic launch me with its palms was inaccurate and unreliable at best. It ended with me flat on my face with a broken nose as often as it worked. But with my new human cannonball title, I wasn't quite ready to call it quits. Which is why we had invented the Crocapult. A croc-powered catapult. We launched dozens of Dan-weighted objects and had honed the process into an exact science over the past few days, even though we'd never tried this move in actual combat. But it worked like a dream. Mostly. I soared over the incoming goons, pointed my free hand down, and activated a single pulse of pressure washer, drilling directly into the top of Mohawk's exposed head for 15 points of slashing damage and another 5 points of scalding damage. That, combined with the trio of Drano bolts he'd already absorbed, dropped him below 30% health. I sailed past the brawlers, coming so close to the ceiling that I almost brained myself on a light fixture, then descended into perfect arcade. In a cruel twist of irony, I'd actually ended up using the quadratic formula to help figure out and fine-tune the catapult trajectory. When my 9th grade math teacher, Mr. Ferris, had told me I'd use it sooner or later, I bet that wasn't what he'd had in mind. I slammed into the spell slinger like a wrecking ball. The landing was less than graceful, and I snapped my left index finger when it jammed into the spell slinger's cheekbone. The break sounded like a pistol going off, but I ignored the bright lance of pain capering through my hand. At this point, a broken finger was pretty much par for the course. And, thanks to my human cannonball title, the fall itself did almost no damage at all. I'm going to make your blood boil, the woman snarled as she rolled out from beneath me and leapt to her feet. Apparently, the furry suppression spell had lapsed, because the spell slinger whipped a hand forward and hurled a bright bolt of red magic directly into my face. The agony was immediate and washed through every inch of my body all at once. True to her word, it felt like my blood was literally boiling inside my veins. My HP dropped at an insane rate, though interestingly hers was plunging as well. I'd be long dead before that mattered, though. It was hard to see or think with the intense pain rampaging through my body like an angry kaju, but I knew what I needed to do. Gritting my teeth and pushing through the searing, blinding torture, I reached into my core and triggered sterilization field. Blue-white light erupted outward, forming a dome with me at its center. The blood boil spell guttered and died, vanishing instantly as the light encompassed the enemy spellcaster, abruptly cutting her off from her mana. My health stabilized at just above 40%, and I looked up at the woman with murder etched into the lines of my face. Her eyes widened in terror, and she tried to quickly backpedal out of the suppression field's area of effect. But that wasn't happening, not if I had anything to say about it. I didn't have an ounce of mana to use, but I didn't need it. I bolted forward and tackled her ass to the ground. I landed on top and quickly straddled her at the hips. In comparison to my bulky frame, she seemed painfully small and frail. She wore leather leggings and a denim biker vest, along with a mishmash of assorted armor, ranging from shin guards and hockey pads to a medieval chainmail. A steel gorget protected her throat and a weather-beaten steampunk hat sat perched on her head, concealing short hair that had been shaven down to the scalp on one side. Unlike all of the monsters I'd killed so far, this was a real human being. She wasn't a horror clown or a giant slug or a gangly nightmare with a toilet for a head. This was a person. A person who had accidentally clipped into this living hell against her will, just like me and everyone else who'd inadvertently got stuck here. I had my hammer raised, ready to drive home the killing blow, but I hesitated. Despite my time in the sandbox, I'd never actually killed a person before. I'd killed plenty of person-shaped things since coming to the backrooms, but this wasn't the same no matter what I told myself. I lowered my hammer. She had no such qualms. She pulled a dagger from her boot and shanked me in the ribs, driving the blade in until it hit bone. My health took another nasty nosedive, dropping down to 30%, and that's when it clicked inside my head. Human or not, if I didn't kill her, she would kill me. Period. End of story. And though I still felt conflicted, I reminded myself that this lady had been ready to flay an innocent woman just because she might know where I was. The backrooms changed people, and though she looked like me, the truth was that I had far more in common with Croc than I did with her. She had traded in her humanity a long time ago, and all that remained was a husk of the woman who had once been. Face Tattoos was back on his feet and barreling toward me, so I slapped the slammer of shielding down. "Let's pog, motherfucker," I thundered, conjuring a cage of golden light. He bounced off the arcane dome and landed on his ass, completely unable to help his companion. "Nope," I growled, raising my hammer, "this is a cage match. No getting out that easy." Then I brought the hammer down on the side of her face. Once. Twice. A third time, until there was nothing but a pulped, bloody mess. Level up. X1 Research Achievement unlocked. Cold-blooded murderer. Congrats, big guy. Looks like you've finally popped your murder cherry. Remember, guilt is just experience points for the soul. Be careful, though, because it gets easier every time you do it. Murder is sort of like riding a bike in that way, except riding a bike doesn't usually leave you with lifelong night terrors. At least, not if you're doing it right. Anyway, sleep tight, I'm sure this pivotal moment won't haunt you for the rest of your days. Reward, 500 experience points, 1x gold Marauder loot token. Title, Cold-Blooded Murderer E. Earn 2x experience points for Delver deaths. Like I said, this shit gets easier and easier every time. This is an evolving title. My chest constricted and my stomach clenched into a knot. I felt sick, but now wasn't the time to get all introspective. Now was the time to fuck shit up. I could deal with the weight of my guilt later, after we'd survived this shit show. I gritted my teeth and yanked the dagger from my ribs, blood gushing down my side in a warm, metallic rush. I tossed the weapon aside and pulled myself off the badly disfigured corpse, wiping a few drops of blood away from my face with the back of one hand. One down, 4 more ass-whoopings left to go. Chapter 39. My health was critically low, and though I'd regained about 8 points of mana during the tussle, that wasn't even enough to fire off a single Drano bolt. The sterilization field vanished, but the golden protection granted by the slammer of shielding still had almost an entire minute left before it zeroed out. Not that I could stay in there that long. Croc was doing its best to hold down the fort against the 3 brawlers, well, 2 now, but things weren't going well. One of the thugs was dead, ripped completely in half with his legs not far from Croc's paws, while his torso was draped over the top of a bank of lockers, bits of gray intestine trailing down to the floor. But the mimic dog was in bad shape, its health sitting at just above the 25% mark. Mohawk must have chugged an elixir at some point, because his HP was back up above 80%, and the other dickhead barely looked like he had a scratch on him. I couldn't just barrel in there, though. I was one stiff breeze away from keeling over, my health was pitifully low, and my mana was running on E, which meant I couldn't cast any of my most devastating attacks. Using the protection of the barrier, I ripped out a Jolt Cola, tilted it onto its side, punched a hole with my demolition screwdriver, then proceeded to shotgun the whole thing like it was 2009 and I was at a barracks party in Pendleton. It took me less than 5 seconds to drain the can, and by the time I was done, arcane power surged through my veins, practically begging to be used. I tossed the can aside and let out a thunderous belch, loud enough to shake the room and wake the dead. Then I picked up the slammer, muttering "that's so single quote 90s," and tucked it back into my pocket, dispelling the barrier of protection. Face Tattoos still had the baseball bat jutting out of his leg, and Temperance was currently clinging to his back, her legs wrapped around his stomach, while she bit at his neck and savaged his face with gleaming black claws. His HP was down below 15%, and I reckoned he didn't have long for this world. Mohawk, however, spun around at the sound of my gaseous war cry. His eyes slid around me and landed on the crumpled and bloodied form of the spell slinger, dead on the floor in a pool of blood and shattered skull fragments. "Natasha," Mohawk whispered, his lips trembling. "No, no, no." The words were equal parts denial and prayer. A supplication to whatever cruel god he believed in. I suppressed another small pang of guilt and used the brief pause to activate Pharmacist's scales, swapping 40 points of mana for an equal amount of health, which pushed me back up to 70%. I was still a long way from fully recovered, but it was good enough for government work. "If you didn't want her to end up dead," I taunted, raising my hammer and resting it against my shoulder, "then maybe you should have avoided the whole murder hobo angle. Turns out that actions have consequences, and the dildo of consequences rarely arrives loved. You're a dead man and you don't even know it yet," Mohawk howled, and then he started to grow. His face turned cherry red and his whole body swelled, veins pulsing and muscles bulging obscenely. Bits and pieces of armor started popping off, until he stood in nothing but shredded camo pants that were so tight they looked like Daisy Dukes. Mohawk stood 9 feet tall, half again as wide, and now had skin that was the blister red of a burn victim. Bony white spikes exploded out of his shoulders and horns jutted from his head while fangs filled his mouth. "This is gonna blow," I muttered, mind racing to form a plan. I was drawing a blank. And before I could do anything, the red monster was barreling toward me like an out-of-control freight train, enormous legs and arms pumping as he ran. I was sorely missing slippery when wet, or any sort of crowd control ability for that matter. Hell, this guy's resonance score was probably scraping the bottom of the barrel, so even bad trip would have been a lifesaver. But I didn't have any of those equipped, nor did I have time to swap out relics on the fly. I'd just have to make do with what I had. I pointed my hammer and activated Doodle Buddy. A blob of living ink rose from the floor, assuming the form of a 5-foot-tall stick-figure girl with a triangular dress, yellow pigtails, and a rough-drawn pitchfork clutched in one hand. The summoned doodle lasted all of 3 seconds. The living drawing raised her weapon and dashed toward the lumbering, red-skinned titan, and was immediately pancaked by a giant foot the size of a manhole cover. It was thoroughly disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. I slammed my hammer back into its loop, then raised both hands and unleashed a Drano bolt from one palm and a concentrated beam of pressurized water from the other. The blue ball of potent corrosive bleach slapped against the giant's chest and immediately went to work, eating through unprotected skin and the muscle beneath, but the freak didn't even seem to notice. That or he didn't care. I lowered my left hand just a hair, so the water blast was aimed squarely at old boy's rod and tackle. That got his attention. Especially when Wild Surge triggered and a second stack of water erosion hit the son of a bitch in the nutsack. But Mohawk kept right on coming, powering through the stream of water undeterred. I idly wondered if he had a relic similar to the gremlin's growing guardian in place. It would make sense for a build like his. I danced back 2 steps and activated Moving Workway, which violently dragged me away from the bright red murder machine. Unfortunately, I didn't see the wooden gym bench until the back of my legs slammed into its edge and I toppled over, landing on my back with a wheeze. I hit the ground like a sack of bricks, knocking the breath from my lungs, but thanks to the rush of pure adrenaline coursing through me, I hardly noticed. I gained my feet just in time to see a fist, larger than my head, driving toward me like a battering ram. I dove right, the fist narrowly passing over my head, then rolled upright with my demolition screwdriver in hand. I lunged, driving the head of the screwdriver into the giant's thigh, dropping his health by a grand total of 7%, and that was with the bloodletting bonus in effect. I wasn't sure what relic he was using, but he seemed to be damn near indestructible. I juked right, but I was too slow by half. A knee shot forward like a piston and nailed me in the chest. There was a bright flash of disorienting light and a wave of force ripped through my body. Something broke. Actually, a lot of somethings broke all at once. It felt like half the bones in my body had just been simultaneously turned to shards of glass. I flew backward like a rag doll and slammed into the lockers with a resounding clang, then slid down into a rubbery heap. I couldn't stand and my right arm hung limp and useless at my side. Mohawk stomped forward with killing intent. Those were the footsteps of certain death approaching, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. The ride had barely begun, and it was already over. Looked like I would end up being just another cautionary tale for Croc to tell future delvers. I couldn't help but wonder what he would say about me. One time, there was this delver named Dan who had terrible hemorrhoids. Ended up having every bone in his body turned into jello. A real shame. He was a good fella. Any last words? The guy asked, looming over me like a gravestone. Your mohawk looks dumb as fuck, I gurgled, blood frothing on my lips. He snarled and brought a foot screaming toward me face, but before the killing blow landed, a leather sofa sideswiped Mohawk like a tractor-trailer, knocking him into the nearby sinks. The sofa, an actual, fully fledged, honest-to-God love seat, flipped over, cushions cartwheeling through the air, and landed at an odd angle against the lockers. It felt like a fever dream, and a host of questions raced through my mind. Most of those questions were furniture-related. Like, why was there a sofa in here? And, where did it come from? Also, who the fuck threw the sofa? Before I could fully work through the flurry of questions, there was a blur of motion, followed in short order by a flash of pale scales, violet hair, and curling horns. I knew the figure even half dead. Jacob the Scales. The level 25 Sendril had a hulking tower shield strapped to his right arm and another shield attached to his left, though that one was forged from crystalline blue light, which emanated from a large sapphire attached to his wrist. Mohawk shook his head, clearly dazed from the blow, then pushed away from the sinks and took a wild swing at the encroaching Sendril. Jacob effortlessly deflected the blow, knocking Mohawk off balance, then smashed him in the teeth with the tower shield. Mohawk dropped to the ground as though his legs had spontaneously decided to call it quits at that very moment. Although Jacob carried no visible offensive weapon, other than the bazooka slung across his back, That didn't seem to deter him in the least from laying the smackdown of the century on Mohawk. Using the dual shield strapped to his arms, the lizard man went to work with brutal, workmanlike efficiency. Jacob curb-stomped one knee, shattering the bone with an audible crack, then proceeded to break Mohawk's other leg with the blunt edge of the heavy metal shield. The enormous thug howled in pain, raised a hand in retaliation, and unleashed a column of noxious green light. The spell hit the surface of the blue shield and evaporated in a harmless hiss of steam. Before Mohawk could fire off another blast, Jacob jammed the blue shield straight down, slicing off Mohawk's outstretched hand just below the elbow. The limb came away cleanly, almost as though the shield had cauterized the wound. The severed limb landed with a wet thump on the tiles. Mohawk caterwauled even louder, understandable, given the circumstances, and reached for Jacob with his other hand. That was a mistake. The last one the man was ever liable to make. Chapter 40. The burning blue shield vanished in an eye blink, and suddenly there was a bowie knife clutched in the Sentinel's hand. Jacob gave the blade a quick twirl, then drove it through Mohawk's palm, pinning his hand to the floor. "If you want to keep the rest of your body parts," Jacob said coolly, "you should just lie there and play dead." Mohawk grunted weakly and made no further move to retaliate. Honestly, it was one of the most lopsided fights I'd ever seen. Like watching a toddler go all out in a no-holds-barred fight against Mike Tyson. In less than 30 seconds, the Hulk was nothing more than a lumpy sack of bloody meat with a badly misshapen head sticking out like a hitchhiker's thumb. He was still alive, however, and I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out why. Obviously, Jacob could kill the man in a heartbeat if he wanted to, yet instead he seemed to be playing with him. Jacob was looking down on the battered and broken Mohawk in pity or disgust. Maybe both. Then he sighed and tsked. What a shame, that expression seemed to say. I fully expected Jacob to put the man out of his misery, but instead he turned back toward the entryway, where a lone enemy still remained. Croc had killed one brawler, and Face Tattoos was dead and thoroughly butchered not far from Temperance's furry white feet. Her boots and outfit were splashed with bright scarlet arcs of blood, which made her look even more feral than before. Croc was splayed out on the floor, a pool of sticky blue liquid spreading out like a halo. The mimic had reverted into its true form, a nauseating mass of tentacles and eyes and too many mouths, and didn't seem to be breathing. I felt cold panic as fear grabbed me by the throat. Was he dead? No, couldn't be. I refused to believe it. Croc had endured so much. There was no way he'd go out like this. Then, just when I was about to give up hope, the dog that wasn't a dog took a ragged, hitching breath and I caught sight of its health bar. There was just a sliver of red remaining, so small I'd almost missed it entirely. But Croc was alive, though for how much longer, I couldn't rightly say. The last of the Red Hand thugs was loitering not far off, though he wasn't in much better shape than Croc. He had one hand pressed against an enormous hole in his side and half his face was just missing, as though it had been burned off by acid. Which was probably the truth, considering that was the douchebag I'd hit with Drano Bolt. Jacob slowly made his way toward the man but stopped a few feet away. This is the part where you run very, very fast and reconsider all of your poor life choices while you do so, Verstanden. The color drained from what remained of the man's face, and he nodded frantically. Then without saying a word, he turned and sprinted back into a connecting corridor before the Sentinel could change his mind. That will cause no small number of headaches, I expect, Jacob muttered, watching the man's retreating back until he disappeared around the corner. With a resigned shake of his head, the tower shield collapsed in on itself until it wasn't much larger than a circular metal frisbee. He slipped it from his forearm and hooked it to his belt with practiced ease. The lizard man bent over and scooped Croc into his arms as though the rubbery mass of tentacles and eyes weighed no more than a small child. Meanwhile, Mohawk was stirring on the floor. His red skin had faded away and he'd shrunken down considerably, though he was still enormous. The catastrophic damage he'd endured was even more apparent. The man's face was a colorful mosaic of blacks and blues, intermixed with splashes of red. Although the white, Bone like spikes had disappeared, they'd left a legion of deep lacerations in their wake. With a weak groan, Mohawk managed to prop himself up on his elbows and crane his neck toward the approaching Sendril. "Please, let me go," he wheezed, his voice weak and the words dripping with desperation. "I'm Hudson's right-hand man. You spare me and I can get you anything you want. Anything. You just name it. Loot. Relics. Women. Whatever." Jacob growled at the man, the sound emanating from deep in his chest. "Quiet," he hissed. "I will deal with you in a moment." "Or I could just deal with him now," Temperance said. She leapt upward and sprinted across the itself, closing the distance between her and the Mohawk in 5 long strides, never touching the floor once. I'd seen the gunslinger perform a similar feat during his battle against the Monarch, so it must have been a fairly commonplace relic. She landed on Mohawk's chest and buried her cleaver right in the man's skull, splitting his head nearly in 2. Mohawk was dead before Jacob could take 2 steps. "Verdammt, Temperance," Jacob said, though he sounded more exasperated than angry. Almost as though he'd expected nothing less from her. "Why did you do that?" "Because I knew you wouldn't have the testicular fortitude to do it," she replied, standing. "I believe the correct phrase is intestinal fortitude," Jacob corrected. "I know what I said," she replied, jerking her cleaver free. She regarded its bloodied edge, then casually banished the streaks of crimson from the blade with a flick of her wrist. "We both know you weren't going to kill him, so I took care of the problem for all of us." She paused and stared down the hallway where the other thug had retreated. "You should have let me kill the other one, too." She pressed her lips into a thin line of disapproval. "You know, there are places in the world where not murdering people indiscriminately is actually considered a virtue," Jacob replied flatly. "And none of those places exist inside the backrooms," she fired back. "The man you let live? He's going to bring back others, and they will not be inclined to show you the same courtesy." "I cannot control the decisions or impulses of others," Jacob said, shrugging his shoulders, "only my own. But your point is well taken, which is why we'd better mop things up here and get moving rather quickly, don't you agree?" "What about him?" Temperance asked, waving her cleaver toward me. "Don't worry your pretty little head about him," the Sendril replied. "You take care of the corpses, I'll take care of him." I didn't much like the sound of that. Jacob took one last long look at the dead brute, then sighed in disappointment and made his way toward me with Croc in his arms. His black boots clicked softly on the tiles as he walked. I braced myself, resigned that this was probably the end for me. I hadn't stood a chance against Mohawk, and Jacob had just ripped him a new asshole without breaking a sweat. He could probably kill me with an aggressive fart from across the room if he wanted to. Especially since my HP was under 10% and I couldn't move my arms or legs. "Just let Croc go," I croaked out as the Sendril drew closer. "He's a good boy." Even speaking that much felt like running a marathon up the side of Mount Everest, while dragging a dump truck with flat tires. Jacob snorted, little puffs of smoke lazily drifting up from his nostrils, then dropped to a knee beside me. He set Croc gently on the tiles. "I am not here to kill you or your pet." "Not a pet," I barked, "a friend." "Sir Gut, your friend, then. Will he be okay?" I choked out through sheer force of will. "Mimics are versatile and resilient creatures," the Sendril replied. "He will need time to recover naturally, but he will be fine. I would be more concerned about yourself." He grimaced, evaluating me through hooded eyes. I felt a cool chill wash over me and knew he was scanning me, though what sort of information he could glean, I wasn't sure. Hopefully, he wouldn't be able to see the emblem tucked away in my spatial core, or I was a dead man walking. Not that I could walk. Looks to be some sort of bone splinter effect. Nasty business. He rubbed his chin, then reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of items. The first appeared to be a small tin of shoe polish and the other was a bottle of Zima. Probably one of the very elixirs I'd sold him a few days earlier. "I'll need to realign your skeletal structure before I heal you," he said, his yellow, reptilian eyes boring into mine. or you'll be irreparably crippled for the rest of your short and unfortunate life. He unscrewed the tin and scooped out a glob of black polish, which he smeared across my forehead without any fanfare or ceremony. The stuff smelled strongly of almonds, and it felt oddly refreshing against my skin. Jacob spread a little of the goop along his own forehead, then sealed the tin and stashed it back in his leather jacket. "Brace yourself, this is going to hurt like a bitch, as you Americans say." He pressed a scaly hand against my chest. I found it hard to believe that whatever he was about to do could possibly hurt worse than having half of my bones turned to dust in the first place, but as a wave of power flowed into me, I realized I'd been so wrong. A swarm of angry fire ants crawled beneath the surface of my skin, acid burbled through my veins, and it felt like someone was breaking and breaking my bones 1,000 times over all at once. The world trembled around me and black crept in along the edges of my vision. I was right on the edge of passing out, which honestly would have been a blessing, but then it was over, and the pain passed as abruptly as it had begun. My HP was still pitiful low, but it had finally stabilized, and I could suddenly move my limbs again. Jacob pulled away, suddenly looking drained and sickly. Bright lines of crimson and black sludge leaked from his eyes and ears and nose and mouth. "You okay?" I asked. He waved away my question with one hand, then took out a linen rag and began to mop the gore from his face. "Just one of the side effects of that particular artifact," he replied with a scowl. "It's a transference salve. Unpleasant, but effective." He lifted the Zima and popped the cap with a thumb, then pushed it into my palm. "Now drink." I accepted the bottle with a trembling hand. "Seems like I owe you a debt of gratitude," I said between gulps of delicious refreshing Zima, the #1 bone juice on the market. "Though I've got a few questions. Like how the fuck did you find us? And also, did you throw a fucking couch at that guy?" Jacob grinned, then reached up and affectionately patted the barrel of his bazooka as though it were a beloved pet. "So for launcher," he said by way of explanation. "Most of my relics augment strength or physical resilience, so it's always good to have a little ranged support. As to how I found you." He dipped his fingers into the pocket of my bathrobe and pulled free a tiny bit of red yarn. A matching piece of yarn was wrapped around one of his fingers. "I planted it on your back in the store," he said. "Between the twinning string and my own racial abilities, it was easy enough to find you." He paused, staring at me with unnerving intensity. "I've been following you for several days now." My eyes narrowed and suddenly the scaly delver was a little too close for comfort. "That doesn't exactly fill me with warm and fuzzies," I said, voice hard. "You saved our ass, but it's sorta offset by the fact that you've also been stalking us for the better part of a week. I guess my question is, why? Why follow us at all, especially if you aren't planning to murder us and loot our bodies?" "You don't have to worry about him killing you," Temperance interjected. "He doesn't kill anyone. He's a pacifist, isn't that right, Jakey?" "I told you not to call me that," Jacob replied, glowering at her over one shoulder. "And I'm not a pacifist in the strictest sense of the word." He waved at the battered mohawk. "I will remind you that I did break both of his legs and remove one of his hands. Plus the knife thing," I added. "Plus the knife thing," he agreed. "But you would have let him live," Temperance said, "because you just don't believe in killing." "I don't believe in killing delvers," he corrected. "Which is fine since you enjoy killing enough for both of us." "Someone has to do it," she said, idly twirling her baseball bat. "That still doesn't explain why you've been following us," I pressed. "The answer is not so sinister as you might think," he replied after a brief pause. "I was simply curious about you. It should come as no surprise that I didn't entirely believe your story. Which is why I followed you. Watched you. To see where you would go. Who you would talk with. I fully expected to see you liaison with one of the sovereign's emissaries. Which sovereign I wasn't sure, but one of them, certainly. Imagine my surprise when I turned out to be wrong. For several days you explored this floor, leaving your survival tips and bits of twinning string. But no one ever came for you. Even still, I was not convinced. Not fully. Not until I saw this." He reached into his coat and drew out the caricature sketch. There were droplets of blood splashed liberally across the paper. It seems you weren't lying about being hunted by the skinless court. He tossed the wanted poster toward me and it flipped and fluttered to the ground. But that still didn't explain why you chose to help Temperance, here, the man continued. You risked life and limb in a hopeless fight to save a person I am certain you have never met before. A thoughtful look flashed across his face. I couldn't make sense of it. What does he have to gain by doing this? I asked myself as I watched you fight a battle you surely could not win. But I could think of no reasonable answer. And then it occurred to me. You were helping because you believe it was the right thing to do. And that's why you saved our asses? I asked, choosing my words carefully. Self-proclaimed pacifist or not, this guy could still mop the floor with my intestines if he wanted to. Because we helped out some rando who was about to have her ears cut off. Among other things, the Central replied. He stole a sidelong look at the barely recognizable corpse not far off. As I told you earlier, I have no great love for the aspirants of the court. And, as an added benefit, this gave me an opportunity to prove to you that I wish no harm on you or your strange companion. He ran a hand along one of Croc's tentacles. I'm sure you will have more questions, but perhaps those are best left for later. As Temperance so insightfully pointed out, the man I let go will likely return with reinforcements, and their leader, Hudson, will not be so easily dealt with as this lot. Best we not be here. He turned an eye toward Temperance, who was crouched over Mohawk's corpse. Have you looted all the bodies? He asked. Is the Pope Catholic? She called back, standing with a strange relic clutched in one hand. It looked like the bright red skull of a demon. She disappeared it through space and time, presumably depositing it into her own personal storage space. Very good, Jacob said, helping me to my feet. Even after the salve and eczema, my muscles were still sore and my joints felt oddly tender, but my legs were steady enough to keep me upright. I bent my arms a few times and flexed my hands, just to make sure everything still worked, then I bent over and scooped Croc up, cradling his rubbery body against my chest. A bleary eye blinked open at me from the massive eldritch limbs, then a mouth hole spoke. Dan? The voice asked, hardly more than a murmur. Even though the thing in my arms didn't look like Croc the dog, it had its voice. Did we do good? Did great, buddy, I reassured it, squeezing the squishy mass tightly against me. It should have been gross but wasn't. Croc may not have been human, but it was my friend, multi-mouth orifices and all. Now let's get you back to the shop. Just promise me one thing, Dan, Croc whispered again, its voice ragged. Anything, buddy. Please make sure Princess Ponypuff doesn't watch me sleep. It's super creepy. Also, I'd like more froyo. I snorted, rolled my eyes, and made my way for the nearest door. You got it, buddy. You can have all the froyo you want. Chapter 41. I lounged in the break room across the cheap, circular table from Temperance the Murder Bunny. The gentle hum of voices drifted in through the opened employees-only door, accompanied by the squeak and scuff of distant feet. The store was busy with the hustle and bustle of new customers. We had fresh meat from the lobby as well as a handful of veteran delvers, who'd trickled in from other floors. Half of our cots were rented out for the night as well as 2 of the 3 private tents. One by Jacob and another by a grizzled level 18 from the 5th floor who had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen some truly disturbing shit. Taylor, the college girl from Oklahoma, was back, and she picked up another stray along the way. A 20-year-old named Stephanie from Fort Lauderdale. The 2 of them both wore haunted expressions and looked almost as shell-shocked as the level 18, but they were alive. That was the important thing. Apparently, they'd made it down to the 2nd floor, and were still recovering from the unfortunate decision. They had moved on to the 3rd floor since then, which was an infinitely better choice. Taylor had acquired some riot gear along the way and had a hockey stick wrapped in barbed wire. Her friend was sporting baggy sweatpants along with a pair of hockey pads, looted from a sporting goods store. Taylor shelled out 3 silver loot tokens for one of the Molotov cocktail relics, while her friend used a combination of shards, relics, and tokens to purchase a basic commo and the complimentary upgrade I'd scored off the receptionist in the lobby. And though I was rooting for them both, they were by no means unique. There were at least half a dozen delvers with similar stories and experiences. Despite the skinless court's attempt to stifle my efforts, business was booming. Baby Hands was keeping the place neat and tidy, and Princess Pony Puff was holding down the fort like a champ, mostly because everyone was too terrified to cross her. Whenever someone tried to haggle, she would just shriek at the top of her lungs like a possessed bullhorn until they relented and paid the full sticker price. We'd need to upgrade the facility before too much longer. Especially if I could get a foothold with the Delvers of Howler's Hold. I pulled my thoughts away from the story and back to Temperance, who was staring at me like I owed her money and she was about to collect by breaking my legs. The lady was weird, and it had nothing at all to do with her being a furry. Well, mostly not that. The quiet stretching between us was intense and unnerving, and I felt an intense need to break the lingering silence. "How do you and Jacob know each other?" I asked over a cup of coffee that smelled like happiness. "He rescued me from a temporal distortion pocket," Temperance replied. "One of those classic boy meets girl, boy saves girl from the maddening torture of the frozen eternity scenarios. A tale as old as time." That wasn't the answer I'd been expecting to hear. Temporal distortion pockets were nasty traps with a wide variety of strange and horrifying effects. Some accelerated time, causing victims to wither away to nothing but dust and bones in a matter of seconds, while others froze time completely. Years or even decades could pass while the victim was imprisoned. Croc and I had even stumbled across one on the 7th floor that actually caused the victim to revert back to a baby. But only their head. Big ol' adult body, little itty-bitty baby head. Super fucked up. Needless to say, we had given all of the time distortion pockets a mighty wide berth. Since Temperance was A, alive, B, looked to be in her late 20s, and C, didn't have a baby head, I was guessing she'd gotten stranded in frozen time version. "How long were you stuck inside?" I asked, genuinely curious. She frowned, her brow knitting in thought. "Time is hard to track in the backrooms, but Jacob and I did the math once. By his estimation, I was trapped for around 330 years, give or take a decade or so." She spoke offhandedly, as though she hadn't just dropped a nuclear-sized truth bomb. 330 years, frozen in a time pocket? I just stared at her in open-mouthed astonishment, the numbers tumbling around in my head. "I call bullshit," I blurted out. "There's no way." "Oh, that you were right," she said, a dash of anger and a hint of sorrow in the words, "but I can assure you it's quite true. My grandparents arrived at Namkeg with the first English settlers in 1626, and my family helped build the Massachusetts Bay Colony outpost from the ground up." "So you're like a settler or something?" I asked. "Weren't you listening? My grandparents were colonial settlers. My parents were farmers. As for me, I was a witch. At least that's what everyone in Salem said before they tried to hang me by the neck for consorting with the devil." A dark shadow flickered across her face, here then gone. "Not that they managed to kill me. Not like the others. My parents gave me up to the church and my own fiancé swore he saw me communing with a familiar. The traitorous twat." She faltered, drumming her fingers restlessly on her mug. "I ran before they could kill me or force me to confess," she said, the words a sneer of contempt. "Better to die cold and hungry and alone in the woods than be tortured and murdered by all the people I trusted most in the world." She looked at me, a deranged smile on her lips. "That's how I ended up here. I got lost in the woods, but instead of dying I wandered into the back rooms. They saved me," she said with a feverish intensity. I wasn't sure if she was telling the truth or lying through her teeth, but one thing was obvious. This lady wasn't playing with a full deck of cards. She was kinda hot, too, though not even remotely hot enough to make up for the sheer level of crazy that was radiating off her in waves. If the Marine Corps had taught me one thing, it was keep your dick away from crazy. "So why did you and Jacob part ways?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation back onto slightly steadier ground. "Nothing so complicated. She took a long sip of coffee. Our personalities clash. He's thoughtful and doesn't like to kill things, while I'm impulsive and strongly believe in indiscriminately murdering anything that crosses me for any reason. We've always had something of a contentious relationship, as you might imagine. He and I decided it was better for everyone if we went our separate ways after he dropped me off with the Howlers. "How long have you been with the Hold?" I asked, finally circling around to the one topic I was keenly interested to learn more about. I didn't want her to feel like this was an interrogation, but this was the first chance I'd really had to ask someone about the elusive safe harbor down on the 7th floor, and I was dying for some more information. After all, information was power, and this lady, crazy or not, had intel I badly needed. "I've been with them for the better part of 3 years, she said. "Some of the best years of my life." "What are they like?" I asked. "The Howlers, I mean. I'm hoping to get a foot in the door and establish a trading network with them, assuming they're open to the idea. One of those, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine type deals." She pondered my question for a long beat. Then a crooked grin spread across her face. "Misfits and weirdos and outcasts and degenerates. Each and every one of them. Just like me. Well, maybe not just like me. Most of them are generally less stubby, though they aren't weak like Jacob. They'll do what needs doing. They're all wonderful. Except the ones I want to kill." "How many of them do you want to kill?" I asked. "I have a list to help me keep track." One hand darted into her skin-tight bunny suit and came back out with a worn and heavily creased piece of paper. She unfolded it with reverent fingers, as though it were a sacred text. Both sides were covered in names. Some scratched out, others underlined or written in all caps. It was a very long list. She tapped a finger against a small clump of names. "Less than 10, she said, scanning the sheet. "Maybe I'm wrong, but 10 still seems like a pretty big number." "For Temperance that is an extremely small number," Jacob said, slipping into the break room from the hallway. The soft squeak of rubber followed as Croc trailed in just behind the central. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even been aware was there. I'd poured a Zima into one of the mimic's many mouth orifices as soon as we'd made it back to the store, but the elixir hadn't done much for the dweller. Even using the pharmacist's scales hadn't done shit. Turned out, Croc had been afflicted with a slew of nasty diseases and debuffs that actively prevented healing elixirs or relics from working. Thankfully, Jacob carried an entire pharmacy worth of salves and potions around with him. He had managed to dig up a specialty brew called Super Strength Almond Water, which dispelled the bulk of the most harmful ailments. The mimic was back in its very human dog form and looked significantly improved, even though it had only been a scant few hours. "There are about 200 or so members of the Hold," Jacob continued, "so that makes up less than 5% of the total population." "Yeah, that doesn't make it sound any better," I replied. "Pretty sure wanting to kill 5% of a people group is a war crime. When you consider that Temperance wants to murder 99% of all people she meets, it's actually a rather impressive statistic." He grabbed a beer from the fridge and collapsed into the seat beside me. Croc padded over, dropped onto his haunches, and rested his head on my knee, goggly eyes staring up at me. "Glad to see you're doing better, buddy," I said, scratching behind one of his rubbery ears. "Thank you," I said, shooting the Central an appreciative glance. I still didn't fully trust the man, but he'd saved my only real friend, and for that I owed him a debt. "Cane problem," Jacob replied, absently waving away my thanks. "It is the least I could do, considering you saved this delinquent here. She and I may have radically different moral philosophies, but it would pain me to see something bad happen to her." He frowned at Temperance. "Not that I truly believe there's anything nasty enough on this floor to kill you, Klein Hayes. Not even the aspirants." Temperance beamed and a small blush crept into her cheeks. "That might be the sweetest thing you've ever said to me, Jacob." "I didn't intend it as a compliment," he replied tersely, "though I am glad you are alive." He paused, frown deepening as he regarded her. "But I do wonder why you were wandering around all by yourself when the Red Hands are obviously out in force." Temperance wrinkled her nose and scrunched up her face. "They kicked me out again," she said. Jacob looked utterly unfazed by the revelation. "What did you do this time, I wonder?" "Hardly an offense worthy of expulsion. It's not even really my fault. Jackson got a little handsy with me, so I cut off his hands to teach him a lesson," she said nonchalantly, as though she were discussing the weather and not maiming another human being. "He survived and the skin scribe managed to reattach both limbs, so I'm not sure why everyone made such a fuss." "I've learned that people can be funny about that sort of thing," Croc agreed, slipping into the last open seat. "A while back, I was helping this delver named Francis, and Francis had one of his arms ripped off in a machinery room on the second floor. I ended up eating the limb, because it was right there, and it was just going to go to waste. But with the way Francis reacted, you'd have thought I was the one that ripped his arm off. Long story short, Francis freaked out, called me a fleshy abomination, whatever that's supposed to mean, then ran headlong into a ravenous pack of skitters, who finished the job. It was a very confusing experience, overall, though I did learn some valuable lessons about human sensibilities and boundaries. Turns out they're extremely attached to their limbs, on account of the fact that they can't spontaneously regrow them the way a mimic can. I can also regrow my limbs, Jacob noted. This is why no one likes Centrals, Jacob, Temperance said, tossing her hands up. They always make everything about themselves. We all know you can regrow your bloody limbs and no one is impressed. I'm a little impressed, Croc mumbled. Jacob stoically ignored her needling. How long did they excommunicate you for this time? Temperance soured and folded her arms across her chest. Indefinitely, not that it's any of your business. Wraith was not at all pleased by my antics. She air-quoted the word, especially since Jackson happens to be his biological brother. Though how two people ended up not clipping together is beyond me. She scowled at the table as though it had personally offended her. But it doesn't matter. I have a way back in. Wraith gave me an assignment and said all will be forgiven if I can resolve a tiny issue they're dealing with. It sounds like this Wraith guy is the person I need to talk to about setting up shop in the hold, I said idly, swirling my coffee. Temperance snorted. If that's what you're after down on 7, you might as well cut your losses and move on to a different floor. You'll never make it through the front gates. Why is that? Jacob asked, leaning forward, his interest piqued. It's been several years since I paid the hold a visit, but I remember them being rather welcoming to outsiders. Things change, Temperance replied. Especially lately. Everyone is on edge. There are whispers of war brewing between the sovereigns. They've locked down the hold. No one in, no one out. Not for the foreseeable future, anyway. They might bend the rules for you, Jacob, but they'll never let him in. Especially since he's the one stirring up all the trouble. They hate the aspirants as much as anyone, but Wraith isn't going to risk starting a war for an outsider. Although. She trailed off, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. Maybe there's a way we could help each other. A cruel, conniving smile stretched across her face and she steepled her fingers in a way that reminded me strongly of an evil villain about to start monologuing. Tell me, Discount Dan, what are your feelings on the blight? Tope continued,